Hello and welcome to the Author's Pen. I'm Terrence Dollard, a professor in the Department of Mass Communication at the University of North Carolina at Pembroke. Our guest today is Douglas Wynne, author of Red Equinox. Doug, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me on, Terrence.
So, why don't you tell us a few things about Red Equinox?
Well, it's a horror thriller. It's set in near-future Boston, the year 2019, and it's a semi-dystopian apocalyptic version of Boston in which the city has been flooded by a hurricane. At the beginning of the story, that's the setting where we encounter Becca Phillips. She's an urban explorer and photographer, and she becomes aware of strange fractal tentacle type imagery in her photos, infrared photography. She sees things in it that weren't visible on site, and that mystery leads her into exploring her grandmother's studies into the occult at Miskatonic University. So, we're name-checking H.P. Lovecraft, the horror pulp writer from the 1920s and 30s, and from there the book launches into a supernatural thriller set in his world, where she encounters cultists who may be responsible for a terrorism plot, and also a government agency that suspects her of involvement, and we take off from there.
So this is a little different from your previous two novels, The Devil of Echo Lake and Steel Breeze. This is really rooted more in sort of this fantastical world where we do have things that can, that don't exist in the real world that can then harm our characters. So how do you put those characters into a real world and have it be believable?
I've always loved fiction that strikes that balance between a familiar setting and characters we can empathize with versus speculative elements of science fiction or fantasy. A lot of the writers that I enjoy most set things in a very familiar world. Stephen King often spins out from things that are very realistic into the wildest paranormal speculative fiction. And Lovecraft himself was really good at creating a journalistic tone in his stories that made them feel almost like a well-perpetrated hoax, that the narrator, even if he was an unreliable narrator, was always skeptical of what he was encountering, almost trying to talk himself out of it. So there's a lot in Red Equinox that's pulled from the headlines. There's the surveillance state issues related to counterterrorism. It's a world very similar to our own, even though it's slightly near future. And yeah, from there things start to get weird and creep in from the periphery.
It is interesting talking about the real world. The opening line of the book is something about how death brings us home. And I found that very interesting. I cracked the book open when I was on a plane to go back to New York for a funeral. And it just struck me that is an interesting way to start a book, and at the same time it brings the themes in the book. You're kind of telling us things that are happening before they happen. And I'm just wondering how much of that is something that's conscious, or it just sort of comes out as you start to write, well, this is just what's in the mind at the moment.
The original first chapter of the book was something different. I kind of knew at the time that I didn't have the right door into the story, that it wasn't the front entrance to this book. When I first wrote chapter one, it was kind of sometimes you just have to find a way in, even if that means jimmying a door in the back alley to get into a story and start writing it, so you can figure out who these people are and where it's heading. In the second draft, I threw that out and rewrote the first chapter, and I do a lot of reworking on openings and first paragraph, first line. But yes, that was a conscious attempt to not just hook the reader, but to kind of present one of the larger themes of the book in a very condensed form. So that first line you're talking about is I think death has a way of calling us home, and when it does, we put on our best. And Becca, like you on that plane, is on her way to a funeral. Um, in that, I see, kind of the seed of what she's going to be facing throughout the book, which is that she's going to keep trying to put on her best, to kind of rise to the challenges that confront her in the wake of her grandmother's death. So yeah, little fractal of the larger pattern, I think, in that opening. I hope.
It's interesting because the character of Becca has a lot of the same ailments that many of the readers will have. It's a book that takes place when the days are getting shorter, and she is going through, I guess, seasonal affective disorder, where she's
Right.
more depressed as the days get grayer. And yet it's sort of a gray tone in the book that she's sort of the light in. It's not really a question, I guess more of a statement. But when you are writing something like that, are you doing a lot of research into this, or is this just the sort of thing that you just put out there and hope that it has a basis in fact?
I'm pretty well acquainted with seasonal affective disorder from friends and loved ones who have faced that. I'm kind of surprised by how many people I know who, when you get talking to them, have some issue with that. And up here in Massachusetts, it's certainly a challenge environmentally to get through the darker part of the year, the icier part of the year. So that didn't require a lot of research. If I think the research there, I would check with people who knew about it to confirm certain things, but it's just stuff that I've absorbed from conversations over the years. Other areas required a little bit more researching into certain aspects of photography and researching the Lovecraftian mythos. There's this whole pantheon of dark gods from other dimensions, and that's a big fun sandbox to play in that a lot of writers have participated in since his death. It's become a very kind of self-perpetuating community of fiction that's referencing other stories. You don't have to be familiar with his work to pick up this book and dive in. I think I've tried to be a good guide to the landscape of that mythology, but I knew those people who really follow it were the ones who were going to call me on it more than people who suffer from seasonal depression. They were the ones who were going to, nail me if I got my references too sloppy. So did quite a bit more research into the old school weird fiction that I was paying homage to.
Now, you say you're paying homage to that. Is this something where you have copyright issues if you make a reference to, you said you're using the shared universe of Lovecraft. Is that something where you get into a copyright issue, or is this something that falls into the public domain, or are you just sort of referencing something that other people will know, oh, that equals this kind of deal?
Lovecraft's Cthulhu mythos work is in the public domain. And you can definitely play with that. Many books are being published. It's kind of snowballed to the point where he's having a real renaissance right now. There's a lot of interest in the genre of fiction that has grown up around his creations. So you don't have to sweat it to reference most of his stories. Other writers who have played with that mythology since his death, their work is copyrighted by and large. So you can't just take anything and everything that's in that larger canon. But yeah, the original source material is fair game.
Okay, that's pretty neat. Yeah, it's interesting now because everything now is I think they've extended the copyright laws so that it's no longer, what was it, 50 years? Now it's pretty much in perpetuity. So, Jack Kirby's family will never get to own Captain America, but as long as Walt Disney's family keeps owning Disney, they'll keep making money off it.
Yeah, I think it's usually 70 years from the author's death or something like that.
Okay. I'm really not as versed as you, I suppose. Now, I do have an interesting question for you. Now, you're from the Massachusetts area, which recently saw a terrorist attack at the Boston Marathon. And I was wondering if that news story had any impact in your writing for Red Equinox.
Yeah, that was definitely one of the original pieces of the puzzle that got me thinking about this story. Um, I was riveted during those few days when they were hunting down the marathon bombers, like anyone in the greater Boston area, and thinking about the motivations, speculating about the motivations for terror acts inspired by a particular religious philosophy, possibly. Um, there's this whole history in the Lovecraftian fiction about cultists who worship dark gods and who want to bring about apocalyptic scenarios. So there's a real parallel there between our current fear of unknown belief systems that may be nihilistic and that may be infiltrating our cities. A lot of Lovecraftian fiction is not set in an urban environment, so I wanted to explore that in a somewhat futuristic modern city, and Boston is the city that I know best. So it's impossible to ignore those parallels once I started thinking along those lines. But in Red Equinox, it's sort of, I think of it the way that Philip K. Dick used to write science fiction that was sort of parallel history. The idea that the Boston in my book is not exactly the same Boston that is in the real world, that the marathon bombing didn't happen in this fictional Boston, but instead these acts by the Church of Starry Wisdom did happen. So it is, in my mind, a very fictional and split off universe from the real one, but yeah, certainly inspired by that. That had a profound influence.
Well, it's interesting as well because the real world obviously has to inspire all of our creative works because, well, that's where we are. Even the most fantastical has to have some inspiration that came out of something, whether it was World War I, or whether it was your Aunt Helen making a delicious apple pie. I don't know if you have an Aunt Helen, if she makes a pie or not.
My grandmother's name is Helen.
Oh, okay.
And she's quite a cook.
Oh, there you go. Hopefully she'll make you an apple pie one day. One could hope. But you reference a lot of urban exploring, which is something that has become sort of a trend in this country where you go to, I've been guilty of this myself, the Kings Park Psych Center in New York. I've gone there a couple of times and snuck into some abandoned buildings, looked around at this creepy old psych center. And in the book, Becca is an urban explorer who goes to a similar institution. And I was just wondering, how you were able to use real experiences. Have you crept into any abandoned hospitals lately?
Not much. I can think of a few places I've been to years ago that might have something of that flavor to them. Yeah, there's some great stuff. Some amazing photographers working these days in urban exploring environments, abandoned asylums and factories and amusement parks. So a lot of that photography did have an influence. My wife's photography also played a role. I remember years ago her shooting an abandoned hotel that we found that was, nature was starting to reclaim the place. And that's the kind of thing that Becca goes looking for in the book. It's kind of part of her character, part of her psychology, that she's seeking out damaged places because she feels damaged, and she's trying to find beauty in the cracks, and she ends up finding some real terrors instead.
Well, I guess that's the way we all sort of look at life. I mean, even if you're somebody who is suffering from depression, you're always looking for that optimistic outcome. And you say she's exploring the cracks, looking for something good, and she finds something that's probably not so good. It's interesting how there's that sense of optimism in the writing, even though we're looking at sort of a dark topic. Now, I'm not incredibly familiar with Lovecraft's work. Most of the reading that I do is printed in 22 pages, comes out once a month, and has a lot of pictures in it, much like the detective comic shirt you have on right now.
Yeah.
So I'm just wondering.
There will be. Excuse me. An Alan Moore comic is coming out that's focused entirely on Lovecraft. It's called Providence, and that'll be out in May. So you can get your Lovecraft cramming in there. You can catch up.
Oh, well, there you go. I was going to ask. I noticed behind you you've got some authors who I assume inspired you. And I was just wondering, what authors do inspire you? I see Stephen King, I see Lovecraft, and I know that in your work there are some of those elements.
Yeah, those guys are certainly huge influences on me. Even more so, I would say Clive Barker was one of my earliest and biggest influences in terms of voice and just the kind of mythic vision that he brings to a genre that's right at the intersection of dark fantasy and horror. Peter Straub is another one. There are a bunch of crime writers that I enjoy, and Neil Gaiman is also one of the gods in my pantheon for that sort of mythic fantasy with a lot of horror as well mixed in there.
Well, I find it interesting because you're a business owner, you're a parent, and this is your third novel, and I understand that you'll be writing a few more in the coming years. And I'm just wondering, on Facebook, you mentioned about the discipline of writing, and I think the quote you had was, "No one aspires to be a jogger."
Yeah.
And I'm just wondering how you're able to find the time between taking care of the animals at the doggy daycare that you run and taking care of your son and all of the other stuff that goes into being a grown-up in contemporary life. How you find the time to sit down and write?
I think it's a matter of finding the little spaces that you can steal back from your day. Being able to write in small bursts, maybe for a half an hour. It would be great if I had the luxury to do longer sessions and really get immersed in it. And sometimes I get that. Honestly, I look back and I have no idea how I've managed to write 3 books. It's something you have to kind of fight for. But the thing you were talking about with jogging, it was like people talk about being aspiring writers. Oh, I'm going to write when I find the time. And I think what I'd said on that was, well, you don't meet aspiring joggers. They get up and they jog. They might aspire to be marathoners or something, but or even Olympiads. But if you want to do something, you'll find a way to make the time for it. And I don't watch much television. I try to get up early to fit it in. Used to be able to cram in a good amount on the weekend if I got up at the crack of dawn because my son was sleeping in. But now that he's in first grade, he's up just as early as me. So I don't know how I'm going to write the next one. We'll see.
So there seems to be, even though this is an art form, and I've discovered this in talking to other writers, that there's a discipline into this art form, and that there seems to be, even though it seems to be something that just comes organically, it's a struggle. No one ever complains about plumber's block. You never hear about a plumber saying, "Yeah, I really wanted to fix those pipes today, but man, I just couldn't. I just couldn't figure out how to pick up that wrench." And we hear about writer's block, and it seems to be sort of an excuse to not be creative. And I've had times when I've tried to write something and it just doesn't feel right, but you have to kind of force your way through it. And who knows, half the time, if you get it up that hill a little bit, the momentum will take you down the other side, and suddenly,
right.
So I just wanted to get your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I think you've said it very well, that it can be an excuse. This idea that you're blocked or that you have to be inspired is definitely, I think, something that you can put between yourself and doing the work. You've got to write on a lot of days when you're not inspired. And I've always found that inspiration comes from doing the work. It doesn't come first. You start writing, and from that, the ideas come out. And it is easy to get stuck thinking, well, I don't know what this scene will be about, so I can't sit down and write it. But sometimes you've just got to put some stuff on the page, and you know that you'll end up cutting whatever it started as. But out of that, something will hopefully emerge. I think when I feel blocked, it's often because maybe the idea that I've chosen for a story isn't the right one for me, and sometimes you just have to accept that and try something different.
Okay, it is interesting. I find if I'm working on a project, I'll have a sheet of paper nearby that I'll scribble down something that I know I want to include later on, and then I'll find myself losing that sheet of paper, but I'll find it and I'll remember, oh, here's where that scene was going to go, or maybe it'll be there'll be a scene that I wanted to write, and I'll write that one scene, and that takes place much later on in the story that I'm working on. But because I knew that scene all the way through, I could put it down on paper, and that's going to help set the tone for the rest of what I'm doing. And I'm just wondering, when you are coming up with ideas for a story, I know you've also written some short stories recently as well. Is this something where it just starts off with a what if, or how do you get that that idea, and how do you know that that's going to be either a short story or a novel, and how do you go from there?
It usually is a what if kind of scenario, and I write in a sort of situational way. If I have a premise, if I have an image or a situation that I can use as a jumping off point, then it's mostly about just constantly asking the question, what would the characters do next? What's motivating these people? What are their external pressures on them? What are their inherent motives? And how can those clash? How can I bring tension into that? I find it's easiest for me to explore those kinds of things when I'm writing something kind of, the length of a novel. It gives me a lot of angles to approach that from, and a plot will emerge out of that. I'm not a great short story producer. I don't come up with a whole lot of ideas that feel suited to short fiction. If I get a few in a year that are publishable, I feel like, yay, I've at least used that part of my brain a little bit, but not like some of the writers I know who really shine in that format.
It's difficult to do things in a brief amount of time. That's why some of the most interesting work you'll see in terms of filmmaking is a 30-second commercial, because they're able to take an entire story of whatever that product is and tell it to you in 30 seconds, whereas the Avengers takes 2 hours to show you that they blew something up.
Yeah, exactly. I'm just long-winded, and I enjoy reading long books. I don't write very long books, but but they're novel length, and I have this suspicion that if I was a better writer, I'd be doing really good short stories, because, as you point out, I could say it all in a shorter space. And great writers are probably writing haikus or tweets or something. I'm not good on Twitter. I need at least as much space as Facebook will give me, even for just messing around. So it's how my brain's wired.
Well, there's nothing wrong with that. I think I'm very long-winded myself. I do a half-an-hour show.
Try to get more concise.
Well, that's the toughest part, is looking at your work. And I did want to ask you about editing your own work, because at some point you said you threw away the first chapter of Red Equinox. So how do you look at something with that fresh set of eyes? How do you give yourself that critical distance?
Time, really. It's really important to give the work a break and get away from it, and be able to read it a little bit more like a reader would, like someone who hasn't seen it before. So it's best to put it away for at least a few weeks before coming back to it, and then I can spot the flaws more easily, which makes publishing schedules a little tricky, because you've got to kind of plan to have time when you're not working, so that you can then have a clearer eye for it. And I also rely on friends who read early work for me, and if they seem to share a common criticism, that's a huge help too.
Well, it's interesting, deadlines. How do deadlines affect your work? Because I know if I'm writing something, if I have a deadline, suddenly I can get everything done.
Oh yeah. Yeah, it's good to know that someone is expecting something from you. It's much easier to buckle down for other people sometimes than for your own nebulous goals. But I used to give myself deadlines before I was publishing too, that I would have a certain draft done by a certain date, and just put the pressure on in that way, so that you can just be more motivated and be more productive. But this year I probably have more lined up than I should have agreed to, and yeah, I don't think sleep is gonna play large in getting some of that done.
Well, Doug, I've been told that we are just about out of time. I want to thank you so much for speaking with us today on The Author's Pen.
Thanks very much for having me on.
And I'd like to thank our audience for watching. We'll see you again next time.